So we have about 100 million neurons, and uh, spinal cord is associated with spinal nerves. And we'll see in this chapter how the spinal cord and spinal nerves are involved in homeostasis, and we'll also look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. Okay, so on a day-to-day basis, spinal cord helps us constantly. Like if you pick up something hot, the grasping muscles relax and you drop the hot object even before you realize uh, that the stuff you picked up is extremely hot. That's an example of a spinal cord reflex. A reflex is quick, automatic response to certain stimuli that involves the neurons only in the spinal nerves and spinal cord. Okay, so other job of the spinal cord is to also integrate the excitatory and inhibitory signals um, that arise here before it gets communicated to the central nervous system. Okay, and the spinal cord has a gray matter and the white matter that we look at in just a second. So the gray matter involves, well, collection of neurons and cell bodies in the central nervous system. Now, I know this won't make sense just yet, okay? So just keep in mind, gray matter is where you'll find a whole bunch of cell bodies, but only in the central nervous system. That's the brain and the spinal cord. And then we'll see the white matter. White matter consists of myelinated nerve fibers, okay? So if you remember, axon especially has bundles of myelinated fibers on them to insulate them, right? So the white matter looks white because of the myelinated part of the neuron in that region. And again, this is just with respect to the central nervous system. And then we have commissures. Commissures are bundles of nerve fibers that cross from one side to another. Okay, so if they cross from one half of the spinal cord to the other half, they'll be called a commissure. And then we'll see some ganglia. Ganglia, or which is plural, and ganglion, which is singular, is a collection of neuronal cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So the moment the nerves leave the spinal cord, a whole bunch of cell bodies are found in ganglia, and they split from there and go on to different parts of the body. The spinal cord is a cylinder of nervous tissue, and it arises from the brainstem at the foramen magnum. So this over here is the foramen magnum of the skull. If you remember your anatomy, so the big hole at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord exits the brain is called the foramen magnum. And the spinal cord occupies 2/3 of the upper vertebral canal, and the inferior margin of the spinal cord ends slightly around L1 or maybe slightly beyond L1. On an average, the spinal cord is about 1.8 centimeters thick, which is pretty thick, and about 45 centimeters long in an adult. And it gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay, so the cervical segment of the spinal cord is right over here, and the part of the spinal cord that supplies the thoracic segment is right over here. And then you have the lumbar segment, and all the way to the bottom, you see the sacral segment. Okay. The spinal cord contains certain enlargement known as cervical enlargement, and you have the lumbar enlargement. These are called enlargement because they're slightly thicker than the the other regions of the spinal cord, because a lot more nerves exit or arise from this region of the spinal cord than these regions that are slightly skinnier. Okay, so you see that the spinal cord arrives at the base of the skull. It goes all the way down, and it tapers at a region known as medullary cone, which is about L1 or slightly beyond L1 lumbar vertebrae. And after the medullary cone, it just falls down, and this loose horsetail-like structure is known as cauda equina. Okay, the medullary cone or the conus medullaris is the inferior end of the intact spinal cord, and this hair-like structure that you're seeing is called cauda equina. So this is where the spinal cord has the true end. Okay, and if you remember in class we talked about epidural administration in between L4 and L5. You see why they administer epidural between L4 and L5. That is because you don't have the cerebrospinal fluid right over here. You're not going to puncture the spinal cord in this area. Okay, so the central canal, which consists of the cerebrospinal fluid, also ends right over here. Okay, and so this over here is the cross section of the spinal cord, and you see these are the vertebrae. So if you remember your anatomy, you should be able to tell that this over here is the posterior aspect and this is the anterior aspect. So this is the body and these are the transverse processes. This is the spinous process of the vertebrae. And right over here is the big hole, which you call the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is the opening through which the spinal cord passes through the vertebrae. And the spinal cord is highly protected, as you can tell, and it is protected by the bone, which is the vertebrae. And it also has 3 layers of connective tissue that we'll look at. It's a very thick layer that keeps the cerebrospinal fluid within the spinal cord intact and keeps the spinal cord intact. Okay, the central canal also has right over here in the space is the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, cerebrospinal fluid plays a very important role in protecting the spinal cord from chemical and physical injury. And the other function of cerebrospinal fluid is to provide nutrients uh, to the central nervous system. So it carries oxygen, glucose, and other substances from the blood to the nervous tissue. So spinal cord has several functions, as we know. It helps in conduction of nerve impulses uh, from the sensory and motor neurons up and down the spinal cord. So information that goes to the brain passes through the spinal cord, and information that comes down from the brain also passes through the spinal cord. So it plays a very important role in neuronal integration. And information is integrated in the spinal cord, especially when you think of reflex action. Now, like I said, when you touch a hot stove, you pull your hand away immediately, even before you realize that the stove is hot. That is called a reflex action. And all sensations like bladder control, hunger, all of these are controlled or integrated in the spinal cord. It helps in locomotion, um, wherein groups of motor neurons that coordinate contractions in skeletal muscles that we use for walking. Even right now, when I'm talking, this information is actually integrated first into the spinal cord before being relayed to the muscles of the tongue, right? So the other function of the spinal cord includes reflexes, right? For reflex action, involuntary response to a stimulus is called reflex action. Why is reflex important? Reflexes are important to prevent our body from excessive damage, okay? And it is vital to not only, preventing you from things like burning. It helps in maintaining posture, coordination of different activities in the body, and protection of the body as well. So, like I said, the spinal cord is protected by a really hard bone, which is the vertebrae. And inside the vertebrae, the spinal cord is again has a secondary layer of protection, which is the meninges. The meninges is three layers of protection around the brain and the spinal cord. Um, they separate the soft tissue of the central nervous system from the cranium and the vertebral canal. And the most superficial layer of the spinal cord meninges is the dura mater. And then you have the arachnoid matter and pia mater. Dura mater literally means tough mother. Dura means tough sheet. Mater means mother. Okay. And the dura mater is the most superficial layer, and it is actually the size of a thickness of a rubber glove that we use in a kitchen, right? So it's pretty thick. So dura mater forms a sac from the foramen magnum in the occipital bone, where it is continuous with the dura mater of the brain. And the dura mater is also continuous with the epineurium. The epineurium is the outer covering of the spinal and cranial nerve. So the dura mater is continuous with this. So here you see the dura mater, the superficial layer, and deep to the dura mater you have the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid matter means similar to spider. Okay, it's called the arachnoid matter because of the arrangement of the collagen in elastic fiber that gives it a spider web-like organization. So this lays right under the dura mater, and it is the space in between the arachnoid matter and the dura mater is called the subdural space. That's right over here. So the space between the two is called the subdural space. The subdural space contains interstitial fluid. Now, the third matter is the pia matter. So pia matter is the innermost layer of the meninges, and it consists of a mostly thin squamous to cuboidal cell cuboidal cell with collagen fibers and some elastic fibers as well. The pia mater consists of a lot of blood vessels, and they supply constantly oxygen nutrients to the spinal cord. Another important structure of the meninges is the denticulate ligaments. The denticulate ligaments are these white triangular shaped ligaments that arise, uh, and these denticulate ligaments are extensions of the pia mater. They fuse with the arachnoid matter and the dura mater, and they play a very important role in keeping the spinal cord intact, and prevent the spinal cord from sudden displacement due to any shock. And the space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater is called the subarachnoid space. So right over here, so you see the pia mater over here. So the space in between the two will be called the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space consists of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so cerebrospinal fluid plays a very important role in absorbing shock and providing nutrients and oxygen um, to the spinal cord and brain. Now, if you've heard of spinal tap. Now, spinal tap is a procedure which you call lumbar puncture. So when they do a spinal tap, they give you a local anesthetic, and they insert a needle into the subarachnoid space right over here to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid. Sometimes they also inject antibiotics directly in here depending on the condition. Like if you have a disease like meningitis, they'll definitely administer medication directly into the subarachnoid space, because meningitis can cause severe brain damage in a matter of hours. Okay, so if you remember, the spinal cord goes all the way to the to the L1 vertebrae, and the the what do you call it? The meninges extend all the way to the second sacrum, but the spinal cord is absent in between the L2 and S2 vertebrae. And this is important clinically because when they perform epidural injections, they can safely administer these injections or anesthetics in between L3 and L5 lumbar, because it is a safe area to access the subarachnoid space without damaging the spinal cord. So they can actually perform the spinal tap in between L3 to L5 regions, okay? Because you still have the meninges in this region, you just don't have the spinal cord. So this is the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, the body. So this becomes the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. The area in between the dura mater in orange and the wall of the vertebrae is called the epidural space. The epidural space is filled with fat for additional protection, and it also contains small blood vessels. And then you see these white ligaments exiting the pia mater. These are denticulate ligaments that prevent the spinal cord against sudden displacement. Okay, and then you have the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space in blue is the region where cerebrospinal fluid is contained. Okay, if you look at the spinal nerves emerging from the spinal cord, you see on either side of the spinal cord, you have two branches exiting the spinal cord. The branch exiting the dorsal aspect is called the dorsal root, and the branch exiting the anterior aspect is called the anterior root or the ventral root. The anterior and ventral root merge to form a spinal nerve, and then they split up, and they actually pass out of the vertebral column through the space known as intervertebral foramen. The posterior or the dorsal roots contain only sensory axon, which conduct nerve impulses from the sensory receptors in the skin, muscle, and internal organs, and take it to the central nervous system. So they convey the message from the organs to the central nervous system. And this little bulge over here is called the posterior root ganglion, and over here you only find the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Most cell bodies of the sensory neurons are not present in the spinal cord. They're present out of the spinal cord in the posterior root ganglion, and most of these nerves are unipolar nerves. If you don't know what unipolar nerve is, you might want to go back to chapter 12, nervous tissue, and look at what unipolar nerve looks like. Okay, and this in the front, in the anterior aspect, is the anterior root that contains axons for the motor neurons, right? So the motor neurons conduct nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors, muscles, and glands. So keep in mind, a posterior root ganglion contain sensory nerves that carry information from the body towards the central nervous system. The anterior roots contain the nerves that conduct nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors. So this picture, you see a cross section of the spinal cord, and you see the gray matter in dark, and this over here is called the white matter. Now, the gray matter consists of neuron cell bodies with very little myelin, and this gray matter also contained synapses, which is junctions between different nerves, and it contains dendrites and axon terminals and all sorts of things over here, but they don't contain myelin, and that's why they look darker. The white matter contains a lot of myelinated axons. And if you remember from the previous chapter, axons that are myelinated, they contain 80% lipids, right? So the white matter ends up looking lighter in color, and that's why we call it white matter. So let's focus on the internal structures. Now let's start with the gray matter over here. The gray matter consists of this region known as gray commissure. Commissure means crossing. So this area where nerves from one side cross over to the other is known as a commissure. So this area is known as the gray commissure. So this area over here is known as the posterior median sulcus because this is the posterior aspect. Sulcus is a groove, and this is an actual fissure or opening. So this is called the anterior median fissure because it is on the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. Now, if you look at the spinal cord, the gray area looks like a butterfly surrounded by white matter. Okay, and the gray matter can be divided into anterior regions and posterior regions, and these regions are specifically called horns. Okay, and some areas in the spinal cord, which is specifically lumbar area, they have an additional region known as the lateral gray horn. Okay, now the region in the front is called the anterior or ventral gray horn. The region in the back is called the posterior or dorsal gray horn. Now, the sensory neurons enter the dorsal region. So when sensory neurons bring an impulse, the nerves are going to enter right over here, and then you'll have a whole bunch of neural cell bodies that synapse with another neuron over here known as the interneuron. Okay, so that's the interneuron. Okay, so when we talk of the reflex arc, a decision is going to be made right over here. And the motor neurons, let me draw it in blue because motor neurons are represented in blue. So when, just say we touch a hot stove, the sensory neuron is going to bring information to the spinal cord, and they will synapse with the interneuron in the spinal cord, which are right over here. The interneuron conveys the neurotransmitters to the motor nerves, and the motor nerves exit the spinal cord. Wrong color. The motor neurons exit the spinal cord via the ventral or anterior gray horn. Okay, so the posterior region, you always find sensory neurons, and the anterior regions, you find motor neurons. If you remember just from the last slide that the postural root ganglion actually contains sensory neurons. So they are the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So if you remember what the posterior root ganglion contains, you'll be able to remember that the posterior gray horn is the area where the sensory nerve enters the spinal cord. So this will be sensory, and right over here will be the motor neurons. Now, like I said, lateral gray horn is not present in every region of the spinal cord. The lateral gray horns are only present in the thoracic, and in the upper lumbar region. So why are they present over here? That is because they're a location where the autonomic motor neurons cell bodies are located. Okay, so in this region, you have cell bodies of, well, cell body doesn't look like that, it looks like this, but in this region you have the autonomic motor neurons that regulate the heart and smooth muscles and glands. So those cell bodies enter the lateral horn in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions. The other parts of the spinal cord don't have the lateral gray horn. Just like the gray matter, the white matter can be divided into regions known as columns. Columns. Okay, there's an anterior white column in the front. So you see the anterior white column. Right over here, you see the posterior white column in the back, and then you have the lateral white column to the side. So if you remember, the white matter consists of myelinated regions of the nerve. Okay, so the myelinated axons are present in the white matter, and these bundles in the white matter, bundles of axons, myelinated axons in the white matter, is known as tracts. Okay, tracts. So the nuclei is the bundles of cell bodies in the gray fissure, whereas tracts are the bundles of myelinated axons in the white matter. Let me remind you that tracts, again, I know this seems to be a lot of repetition, but tracts are bundles of axons in the central nervous system only, that's present in the white matter right over here. Okay, nerves, on the other hand, are bundles of axon in the peripheral nervous system. There are two types of tracts. You have sensory tracts. Sensory tracts are obviously present towards the dorsal region of the spinal cord. Sensory tracts convey or relay the information to the brain. Okay, so sensory tract relay the information to the brain. So they get in through the dorsal region into the dorsal white column and the dorsal horn, and they are communicated to the brain. Okay, but the motor tracts, on the other hand, which are in the front, so let me see, the motor tracts over here carry information from the brain to different body parts. Okay, so this over here, sensory tract, is also known as the ascending tract. Should always use the wrong color. Sensory tracts are also known as ascending tract because information is carried up to the brain, and the motor tracts over here are also known as descending tracts. Descending tracts, because information from the brain, or the command from the brain, is carried down to the body, to different parts of the body. Now, these sensory and motor tracts of the spinal cord are obviously continuous with the sensory and motor tracts of the brain, without which communication cannot occur, right? So the sensory neurons, let's revise this again. Sensory neurons carry the signal into the spinal cord through the dorsal root ganglia and right into the dorsal column and the dorsal horn. From here, they carry the information into the brain via sensory tracts. So these are just extensions of the sensory nerves from right over here. And the motor neuron receive the command from the brain through descending tracts, and they carry the information from the spinal cord to different parts of the body. Okay, so let's revise this again because this gets a little confusing. So the pairs of horns in the back, well, it is called the posterior or dorsal horn. The pairs of horn in the front is called the anterior or ventral horns. And these areas are called columns. So this becomes the posterior column and this becomes the anterior column. Then you have the posterior median sulcus, and this becomes the anterior median fissure. And in between the two, this hole is the central canal. The posterior or dorsal root of the spinal nerves always carry sensory fibers. So sensory fibers bring information or relay nerve impulse to the spinal cord. They enter through the posterior aspects. Okay, and the information from the spinal cord is conveyed to the brain through ascending tracts. Now, the anterior root of the spinal nerves always only carries motor fibers. The motor fibers exit the spinal cord via the anterior horn and the anterior column. Okay, and the information to the anterior horn is brought down from the brain through descending tracts. And we have the lateral horn over here. The lateral horn is only visible from T2 through L1 regions, and they contain the autonomic nervous system neurons. So they mainly contain the autonomic motor neurons for the heart and smooth muscles, etc. So a condition of the developmental condition or defect of the spine is spina bifida, which you probably have heard of. Spina bifida in the spinal cord happens when the spinal cord fails to completely develop. It instead ends up in formation of a cyst, and that's most serious condition is called spina bifida cystica, when the cyst fills with fluid. Okay, so when this happens, the uh, condition cannot be cured, but there are several treatments available for managing the disease and preventing complications. Now, in some cases, if the condition is diagnosed before birth, the baby can undergo surgery while still in the womb in order to minimize the defects of the spina bifida. Okay. Now, nowadays, all pregnant women are suggested to have a folic acid, which is a part of essential diet for all women of childbearing age, and that's why you take supplements of folic acid so that the central nervous system can develop properly, and this reduces the risk of spina bifida in the baby. And the defect usually occurs within the first 4 weeks of development. So folic acid supplements should be taken before conception, so the mother has enough levels of folic acid for the developing fetus, because this condition starts developing very early in the developmental ages. So let's quickly revise before we move on. So this over here in the back is the posterior aspect, and this in the front is the anterior aspect. The posterior aspect is where the sensory neurons enter the spinal cord. The anterior aspect is the region where the motor neurons exit the spinal cord, and each nerve carry two sets of each nerve carry two sets of neurons. Okay, so each nerve in the body will have sensory neurons and motor neurons. Okay, we'll have two sensory neurons. One would be visceral sensory neurons. that carry sensations from the internal organs, and then you'll have somatic sensory neuron that carry information from areas like the external region of the body, like the skin. And then you have autonomic sensory neurons that carry information from the brain to the cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles, the glands, anything that moves due to involuntary action. And then you'll have somatic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons will carry message from the brain to the skeletal muscle. Okay. So let's just say somebody pricked you with a pin over here. I'm going to pick the laser pointer again. All right, somebody picked you with a pin on the skin, and the sensory receptors like the mechanoreceptors and the pain receptors detect the stimulus, and they transfer the impulse to the sensory neurons over here. The sensory neuron relays the information to the posterior root, so to the spinal nerve through the posterior root. Okay, from the posterior root, the sensory neurons can proceed in three possible paths. The first part is that the axon of the sensory neuron can carry the information to the brain via the sensory ascending tracts. Or the second path is that the sensory neurons synapse with these purple neurons known as interneurons. Interneurons. Interneurons are neurons which transmit impulses between other neurons, okay, especially in a reflex arc. Now, these interneurons can then ascend into the brain via a sensory tract or an ascending tract. And the third path is, oh, what happened? Anyway, the third path of this of the sensory neuron is that the axon can enter the posterior gray horn and then synapse with the interneurons. These interneurons can then in turn synapse with the motor neurons, and these motor neurons can be involved in the spinal reflex pathway. So these motor neurons convey the information to the skeletal muscles of your arm, and then you pull your arm away. So these are the three possible pathways for processing of a sensory information from an external environment.